Welcome to this tutorial, Create an SAP Cloud Application Programming Model project for SAP HANA Cloud. In this particular tutorial, we're going to use the wizard for the SAP Cloud Application Programming Model to create a project in the SAP Business Application Studio, but we're going to do it in a way that will also support SAP HANA Cloud native development. In later tutorials in this series, we're going to combine the two projects types, in particular, creating calculation views and stored procedures and seeing how they integrate into a cloud application programming model project. Now, what you're going to learn in this specific tutorial, though, is how to create an application with the wizard for the SAP Cloud Application Programming Model and how to use the local Git repository for development testing purposes. Now, before you attempt this tutorial, you should be sure that, or you should be aware that this tutorial is designed for SAP HANA Cloud. It is not compatible with SAP HANA On-Premise or SAP HANA Express Edition. The steps shown here are specific to SAP HANA Cloud and development on SAP BTP. In order to proceed, you should have already created an SAP BTP SAP HANA Cloud instance. There's a link in the tutorial prerequisites for how to do that if you have not already done so. And you should have already done the basic setup of the SAP Business Application Studio. Also a link in the prerequisites if you need help getting started with the SAP Business Application Studio. Now, to start off, we're going to want to launch the SAP Business Application Studio. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to keep the tutorial steps on one side here so we can easily track where we are in the tutorial as we do the exercises. And then I'm going to go ahead and open my BTP cockpit. And I'm going to go into my particular account that I work in. And when we want to launch the Business Application Studio, one of the easiest ways to do this is go to Instances and Subscriptions from the main sub-account page. And then if you have everything set up correctly, you should see an SAP Business Application Studio entry under Applications. And you can click on the link or click on the little icon next to the link, and that will start the application for you. Next, we're going to want to create a DevSpace. Now, in the SAP BTP trial and the free tier, you're limited to only 2 DevSpaces. I have the same limitation here in my account that I've logged in as. And only one of them can be active or running at a time. I do have another DevSpace that I use for HANA native development alone, but I have that in a stop state. So I'm going to be able to create another DevSpace and start it. If you've done other tutorials like I have, you might have other dev spaces. You might have to even delete one of them to get down to the 2 limit, because we're going to be creating one here for the Cloud Application Programming Model. Now, you might also have a blank screen here, largely, without a dev space already created if you're starting brand new. On either case, you're going to have a create dev space button, and that's what you're going to want to do to get the process started. Now, dev spaces are a nice way to have pre-configured development environments. SAP set up several different types, like the HANA native development or the full stack cloud application development or Fiori, with all the necessary tools that you need to get started doing that particular kind of development. And that's what we're going to do here is we're going to choose full stack cloud application development. And you'll see that it adds in Fiori tooling, CAP tooling, HANA Database Explorer, everything that we're going to need to be able to do CAP development. But in addition to that, we can add other extensions, optional extensions. For instance, I know that later we're going to be doing some calculation view development, so I'm going to go ahead and add that in. And you'll see that it automatically adds the SAP HANA tools in as well. That's what we're going to need for this tutorial. Now, if you miss this step, you can always come back to an existing dev space later, put it in a stopped state, just like my other dev space was earlier, and then press the little pencil icon, and it'll take you back to the screen so you can add in additional tools. So that's one of the nice things about dev spaces, the Business Application Studio, is they're highly configurable, they're easy to change after the fact, And once you've added tools to your DevSpace, SAP is going to keep them up to date automatically for you. So you don't have to worry about updating individual tools or extensions. It's all going to happen automatically. So now that we have our DevSpace configured, full stack cloud application, with the additional HANA tools that we're going to need, let's go ahead and give it a name. I'm just going to call this CAP Dev, because I'm going to be doing Cloud Application Programming Model development in it. And I'll go ahead and say create DevSpace. Now, when I first created DevSpace, it's going to take a couple minutes to start. It's really creating an entire Linux virtual machine in the cloud that I'll be able to connect to. I'm going to have access to the file system. I'm going to have access to the shell to run arbitrary commands, to test my application. It's a great little sandbox development environment where I'm going to have full access to do my development. I'm going to have basically a browser-based version of Visual Studio Code running there as well. I'm going to have all the extensions that are pre-configured into the DevSpace, or the ability to add additional extensions that I choose to the environment, and that full file system and shell access. That's going to allow us to install additional software, to fully test our application, everything we need to do development right in a web browser. Now we see here it's reached the running status, and that means I can go ahead and click on the DevSpace name, and that's going to launch us into the development space. This is going to bring up the Business Application Studio with that DevSpace and its associated file system and everything loaded into the web browser. And at this point, for the tutorial purposes, I'd really recommend that you go ahead and add that to a favorite so it's easy to get back to this DevSpace quickly, as we're going to be going back and forth between different tools. And if you accidentally close the browser, you're going to want to be able to get back in here pretty easily. Now that our DevSpace is running, but before we actually start creating our project, we want to do one more configuration step. And we should really only have to do this the first time when we start up a new DevSpace. And that's to configure our connection to Cloud Foundry. Although our HANA Cloud instance isn't running in Cloud Foundry, it's running multi-environment, we still want to create HDI containers as part of our CAP development so that we can immediately deploy and test against a real HANA database. And we do that using Cloud Foundry. So what we want to do is we want to come here using the Cloud Foundry extension, and I'll just click on that, and immediately shows me any services or applications that I have running in my target Cloud Foundry, but I don't have a target yet, nor am I logged in. So this is going to be a good opportunity to go ahead and say, yeah, I want to log in. So we make that a little bigger. And the first thing that we have to supply is our Cloud Foundry endpoint. Now, this defaults into a particular API URL. It may not be the right one for you. What you should do is you should go back to the BTP cockpit, and you should go to your sub-account level here. And for your particular sub-account, it's going to tell you the correct API URL. You'll see it right here. I went back up one too high. And right here, API endpoint for your Cloud Foundry environment in your sub-account. This is the URL that you should see and you should use at this step. Now, it just so happens the default works for me because I'm in US 10. So you see that it has defaulted to US 10. That is correct. And from this point, I can put in my credentials. So my BTP username is my email address. And then your password, if you know it. If you don't, you can use SSO password, and it will open another browser window and log you in with SSO and give you a code that you can come back and put in here to log in. I'm going to go ahead and log in with my username and password. You'll see that I'm being signed into Cloud Foundry. And once I'm signed in, it's going to ask me for my target Cloud Foundry organization and space. Well, I do have a couple Cloud Foundry orgs running in this sub-account. I'll go ahead and choose, that's not mine, there's mine. And then I only have one space in that org, so it defaulted to that space, but you should check that and make sure you're targeting the correct space. We'll go ahead and click Apply, and this is going to set it for the entire Business Application Studio environment. It's automatically going to target that particular Cloud Foundry environment, and now we can see my services that I have created in that particular space, as well as my running applications or any deployed applications. Now, you're probably seeing less here unless you've done other tutorials, and that's okay. You might not see any services, you might not see any applications, but it no longer says that you need to log in, so you'll know you're good and connected. I have more because I've done some other work for other tutorials already in this environment. At this point, we're ready to go ahead and create our new project. So we can go back to the Explorer window, or really we could collapse this because it doesn't matter too much. We want to concentrate using the welcome page here to create a new project and create that project from an existing template. So that's the choice that we're going to choose here. Let's say create project from template, and it's going to give us a list of templates to choose from. You're going to see we have basic multi-target application, Fiori, HANA database project. But the one that we want to use is we want to create a CAP project, an SAP Cloud Application Programming Model project. So I'm going to go ahead and choose that. I'll keep the other preferences at their default, and I'll go ahead and say start. That's going to ask me some questions about my CAP project. First of all, I'm going to name my project My HANA App. You name it whatever you want, but what I do recommend if you're doing this tutorial is that you match that name, because that's going to be used in multiple places, in configuration files and things like that. It just make it easier to match up to the tutorial if you keep the name exactly the same. Now you have your choice of Java or Node.js based development. We're going to do Node.js JavaScript based development in this tutorial, so I'll leave it to the default of Node.js. And then we have some choices of how do we want to configure our initial project. Well, we know we want to do SAP HANA Cloud deployment and testing against HANA Cloud while we're doing development. I know that we're going to use an SAP application router because we're going to add Fiori UI to our application. I'm going to do MTA-based development for deployment to Cloud Foundry. And I'm going to add in CI/CD pipeline integration. I don't need any of these other features. And the nice thing about the Cloud Application Programming Model, if you would leave one of these options out or decide to add it later, they're simple command line utilities using the CDS command from the shell that you can add any of these other project aspects into your project after you've ran the wizard. So it's not that you have to have everything selected exactly at this point. But let me go ahead and say finish, and this will start generating our project. We'll give that a second to restart and load in our project. And what you can see here is we already have a shell of a project. We've got an app folder, and that's where our UI content is going to go. We have a database module folder, and that's where our schema definition and our HANA database artifacts are going to go into the DB folder. We've got an SRV folder. That's our service module. That's going to be where we put the definition of our OData service, as well as any exit handlers or other logic that we need to add to our service. There's also an MTA YAML file. If we go ahead and open this up, this is the master configuration file for the entire project. It's where these modules are defined, and it tells it what path to find them in. So our service module, it tells us that it's a Node.js type application, and that it should use the sources in Gen SRV to deploy that. It also tells how everything's related and what dependent services, they're called resources in the MTA YAML, which dependent services the particular module should connect to and would be required for it to run and deploy correctly. We have our services defined here. We can already see that we have an HDI container that we're going to have in here, and that both our service module and our database deployer to deploy content into the database are dependent upon that HDI container resource. We have also already initialized authentication for our application. We'll talk more about that later once we configure the authentication. But you can see the wizard's pretty complete here just to start us off. Now, our basic project is also the package.json file is pretty important here because it defines dependent modules, external libraries that our project needs to run, like the Cloud Application Programming module itself. That's the @SAP CDS module. But there's open source modules like Express. There's other SAP modules that you see here. So we're able to pull these into our project by defining what version that we need here in the package.json file, but they're not installed yet. That's why we have these little squiggly lines. It says the Express package is not installed. So we need to do a step to install these, and that's easy enough to do. We can just open a terminal here. I'm just going to say open a new terminal window. And from the command line, we can use npm, the node package manager. And we can just say, let me bring that back up here. We can say npm install, and it's going to read all the dependencies and dev dependencies that we have listed in our package.json. It's going to go out to the internet and find those packages, download them, and any dependencies that they have, because it's not just this handful of modules that we have here. There's actually 463 of them that were installed because we need the dependencies of the modules that we're dependent upon. Now, all this content was downloaded, and we can actually see it here in our node_modules folder that's been added to our project. All those libraries, all the JavaScript logic has been downloaded and is now part of our project and ready to be used inside our project. Now, the other thing that we need is a little utility that will help us with HANA development, and we can also install that using npm. So let me just clear out my terminal here, and I'm going to say npm install globally. That's what this -g says, and then the name of the tool is HANA CLI. And when I hit enter, that's going to go out to the internet, download it and all of its dependencies, and install it locally as well. We'll give that a minute to finish up its installation. There we are. Now that that's done, we can do a little test here if you want, just to see if it installed correctly. We can do like -v for the version. Oh, no. On a CLI version. And it will show us the version of the tool that's installed. We can see that it's running the 23.11.1 version. We can also see that that is the latest that's available. That's what I would expect with installing it fresh, but you can always check your version and all the dependencies and additional libraries that it installs as well. So now that we have this all downloaded and available, we're ready to really start development. The only one last thing that I want to do is I want to go ahead and initialize this project for Git, and we'll use Git as our repository for version management and external storage and tracking of our project. Now, the Business Application Studio has a built-in Git client, so we just can use the source control button on the side of the screen. I'm going to make that a little bit bigger, just easier to read. And first, we want to initialize for our project for a repository. Now, we could connect to a remote repository, and you really should if you're going to do development and you're going to share that with other developers, or you just want to make sure that it's persisted outside the lifetime of the Business Application Studio, which for any real development you'd want to do, you should connect this up to an external Git repository. For instance, at SAP, we use GitHub. But for our purposes here today, for this workshop, this tutorial, we're just going to use a local Git repository that's built into the Business Application Studio. So I'm just going to go ahead and say, yes, take my project, initialize it locally. I don't give it a URL to a remote repository. And at this point, I can make my first commit. I can say initial commit. But what I want to do is I want to tell it, take all my changes and stage them all so that they're all ready to commit. And now I can go ahead and say commit. And at this point, I could publish this branch to an external repository, but I am getting version management every time that I do a commit. And at the end of each exercise in this tutorial group, you could commit and you'd have local version management at least. But again, for a real project, it's recommended that you connect to a remote repository, like GitHub or some other external Git repository. And that allows you to have a copy of your code that lives outside the Business Application Studio DevSpace. Right now, if I were to delete my Business Application Studio DevSpace, I would also lose my version history and any backup of my project because this Git repository is part of the DevSpace itself. It's an easy way to get started, but not really good for the longevity of a real application. It's okay when we're just sandbox playing around doing tutorials, but you'd want to use a real one for any real development.